Jackson returns to his hometown after 20 years, seeking justice for a crime he didn't commit. But what he uncovers will shock you. Corruption, secrets, and a powerful family determined to silence him. Will Jackson finally expose the truth, or will the past consume him? Watch till the end to find out. Make sure to subscribe and leave a comment. Let us know where you're watching from. Jackson sat behind the wheel of his sleek black car, watching the familiar scenery of his childhood hometown roll past the windows. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as the first memories began to surface. Memories he had spent 2 decades trying to suppress. The town hadn't changed much in all these years. The streets, the buildings, even the people seemed stuck in time. But the weight of the past pressed down on him with every turn. He hadn't been back since the day his family was driven out, scapegoated and ostracized for a crime he didn't commit. But now, years later, Jackson was a different man. He was no longer the scared teenage boy accused of a heinous act. He had made a name for himself in the world of business, becoming a wealthy and influential entrepreneur. Success had given him power, and now he intended to use that power to clear his name and expose the corruption that had forced him to leave everything behind. As he drove past the old diner on Main Street, the memories became more vivid. This was where it had started, where the town had first turned against him. He recalled the glares, the whispered conversations, the way people crossed the street to avoid him as if he carried some invisible plague. The humiliation, the injustice, it was all still there, just beneath the surface. Jackson pulled into the parking lot of the local cafe, deciding to stop for a moment before heading to his old family home. He needed time to process being back in this place, to gather his thoughts before confronting the memories he had buried deep. He parked his car and stepped out, taking in the familiar smells of coffee and fresh pastries. For a moment, it almost felt like nothing had changed. But as he entered the cafe, the feeling of familiarity vanished. Heads turned as soon as he walked through the door, and he felt the eyes of the patrons on him, judging, assessing. Some recognized him. Others simply saw a successful black man walking into a place where he clearly didn't belong in their minds. The tension was palpable. Jackson spotted an empty table by the window and made his way over, ignoring the murmurs around him. He had just sat down when a voice interrupted his thoughts. Well, look who's back." Jackson looked up to see a man standing by his table, arms crossed. It was Tim Roberts, one of his former classmates from high school. Jackson remembered Tim vividly. He had been one of the boys who spread the lies that led to Jackson's arrest. A smirk curled across Tim's lips as he pulled out a chair and sat across from Jackson without being invited. "Didn't think you'd ever have the guts to show your face around here again," Tim said, his voice thick with sarcasm. Jackson felt the familiar anger rising in his chest, but he kept his composure. "I'm not here to hide, Tim. I'm here to take back what's mine." Tim chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Take back what, exactly?" "Your reputation? No one here gives a damn about you or what you think you lost. You should have stayed gone." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that." The smirk disappeared from Tim's face. The playful banter he had started turned into something darker as he realized Jackson wasn't the same boy he used to torment. Jackson's success, his confidence, it unsettled Tim. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat before standing up, leaning in close to Jackson. "Don't stir up trouble, Jackson. People around here don't forget easily. You come looking for a fight, you'll get one," Tim warned before walking away. Jackson watched him leave, his jaw clenched tight. The encounter had solidified one thing for him. He wasn't welcome here, and they didn't want him back. But that was exactly why he had returned. The past couldn't remain buried forever, and Jackson wasn't leaving until he uncovered the truth. After paying for his coffee, Jackson stepped back into the afternoon sun, the weight of the town's disdain pressing down on him. But he didn't care anymore. The boy who had been afraid of their judgment was long gone. He had built a life, earned respect in circles far beyond the small-minded people of this town. And now he had come back to face the demons they had left him with. He drove through the familiar streets toward his old family home, the house they were forced to abandon. When he arrived, the sight of the faded white porch and peeling paint triggered an avalanche of memories. He could still see his mother on the front steps, tears in her eyes, begging the police not to take her son away. He could still hear the crackle of police radios, the clank of handcuffs, and the silence of neighbors who watched but said nothing. Jackson sat in his car for a long time, staring at the house, lost in thought. He had been a teenager then, powerless against the forces that had torn his life apart. But not now. He had power now, and he wasn't going to let them silence him again. As he stepped out of the car and walked toward the house, he made a silent vow. This town had taken his innocence, his family, and his peace of mind. Now he would take back everything they had stolen. Jackson stood in the dimly lit kitchen of his old family home, surrounded by the faint echoes of a life that had once been full of laughter and warmth. Now the house felt cold and abandoned, a relic of the pain his family had endured. He leaned against the counter, memories flooding back, memories he had tried to bury but could no longer ignore. It was here, in this very kitchen, where the police had dragged him out in handcuffs all those years ago. His mother had stood in the doorway, her tear-streaked face etched into his mind like a scar. She had pleaded with the officers, insisting they had the wrong person. But no one listened. No one cared. To them, he was just another black kid in the wrong place at the wrong time. Jackson's thoughts swirled as he replayed that day in his mind. The cold metal of the cuffs biting into his wrists, the neighbors peeking through their curtains but staying silent. It was a collective betrayal, one that had haunted him ever since. Shaking off the memories, Jackson walked into the small living room where boxes of old family belongings were still stacked against the walls. He found a photo album on one of the shelves, dust covering its surface. Flipping through the pages, he saw images of a simpler time, before the accusations, before the town had turned on him. His heart ached at the sight of his younger self, full of hope and ambition. But hope had long since been replaced by something darker, a determination to set things right. That night, Jackson made his way to a quiet bar on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the kind of place most locals visited, but that was exactly why he had chosen it. He needed to meet someone who might hold the key to unlocking the truth about what had happened all those years ago. Sitting at a corner table, Jackson nursed a drink as he waited for the man he had contacted earlier that day. He had been surprised to find out that the journalist he'd reached out to had agreed to meet him on such short notice. Thomas Keller, a seasoned reporter known for exposing corruption, had a reputation for digging deep into hidden secrets. Jackson had read about his work in larger cities where he had taken down powerful politicians and shady business figures. Tonight, Jackson hoped Keller could help him do the same in his small town. After a few minutes, the door to the bar creaked open, and Keller stepped inside. He was a tall, thin man with sharp features and a no-nonsense expression. His presence commanded attention as he made his way over to Jackson's table. "You must be Jackson," Keller said, sitting down across from him without preamble. His voice was direct, his gaze piercing. Jackson nodded, offering a firm handshake. "Thanks for meeting me. I followed your work for a while. I think you're the only one who can help me get to the bottom of this." Keller leaned back in his chair, studying Jackson. "From what you told me, it sounds like you've been wronged. But I need more than just your word. If we're going to expose the truth, we need evidence. Solid evidence." Jackson had anticipated this. He pulled out a small folder from his coat pocket and slid it across the table. Inside were old police reports, witness statements, and clippings from local newspapers covering his arrest. But there was something more. A name that had come up repeatedly during his own investigation: Richard Hawthorne. Hawthorne was the son of a wealthy and influential family in town. His father had owned half the businesses on Main Street and had always been close with the local police. Rumors had swirled for years that the Hawthorne family had been involved in some shady dealings, but no one had ever been able to prove anything. "I've done some digging on my own," Jackson said, watching Keller's expression as he flipped through the documents. "Hawthorne's name keeps coming up. I'm almost certain he was the real culprit, but his family covered it up. They needed someone to blame, and I was the easiest target." Keller raised an eyebrow. "You think the Hawthornes framed you?" Jackson nodded. "I don't think... I know. The question is, can we prove it?" Keller set the folder down and looked Jackson in the eye. "If what you're saying is true, this could be big. Really big. But going up against someone like the Hawthornes isn't going to be easy. They've got money, influence, and a lot of people in their pocket." "I don't care," Jackson replied, his voice firm. "I've spent too long letting them get away with it. It's time the truth came out." Keller leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "All right. Here's what we're going to do. I'll dig into this on my end. Look into Hawthorne's connections. See if there's anyone who's willing to talk. But you need to keep a low profile. If the Hawthornes catch wind that you're back and digging into this, they'll shut you down before we can even get started." Jackson nodded. He knew Keller was right. The Hawthornes were powerful, and they wouldn't hesitate to protect their own interests even if it meant silencing him for good. As the two men finished their drinks and left the bar, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a dangerous path, but he had come too far to turn back now. The next morning, Jackson visited the town's courthouse to look at old case files. While searching through records, he noticed something odd. Several key pieces of evidence from his case were missing. Witness testimonies, forensic reports, all gone. It was as if someone had deliberately erased any trace of what really happened that night. But Jackson wasn't deterred. If anything, the missing evidence only fueled his determination. Someone had gone to great lengths to bury the truth, and he intended to uncover it, no matter what. That afternoon, Keller called with news. "I've found something," the journalist said, his voice tense. "One of the officers involved in your arrest left the force under suspicious circumstances not long after your trial. Word is, he had a falling out with the Hawthorne family." Jackson's heart raced. "Can you track him down?" "I'm working on it," Keller replied. "If we can get him to talk, we might finally have the break we need." As Jackson hung up the phone, a sense of purpose settled over him. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and for the first time in years he felt like justice might be within reach. But deep down, he knew that the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous things would become. The Hawthorns wouldn't go down without a fight, and Jackson was ready for it. The courthouse's marble floors echoed with the sound of Jackson's footsteps as he left the building. The weight of what he had just uncovered gnawed at him. The deliberate erasure of evidence from his case was more than just negligence. It was part of a calculated effort to protect someone. His instincts were right. The powerful Hawthorne family had pulled strings behind the scenes, and now he had a trail to follow. But the path ahead was riddled with danger. Back at his rented house, Jackson paced the floor, thinking through his next move. Keller's tip about the officer who had left the force in mysterious circumstances lingered in his mind. If they could find this man, they might finally get some answers. But Keller's warning about keeping a low profile rang even louder. This was a small town, and news traveled fast, especially when it involved the Hawthorns. That afternoon, Jackson sat in his living room with stacks of old police reports and legal documents scattered across the coffee table. He sifted through them, piecing together the timeline of his arrest, looking for any name or detail that might have been overlooked. Every fact, every omission felt like a clue, but the truth still felt just out of reach. As the day wore on, the house phone rang. Jackson picked it up, already knowing who it was. Jackson. Keller's voice was tense, the kind of tone that carried bad news. You need to be careful. What's happened? Jackson asked, straightening in his seat. They know you're back. The Hawthorns, Keller replied. Word spreading fast around town, and not just in whispers. They're gearing up to fight this. Jackson gritted his teeth. He had expected resistance, but not this soon. What are they doing? I've got sources telling me that they're already working on a smear campaign. They're going to paint you as a troublemaker, someone who's just looking for revenge after all these years. They'll dig up anything they can on you, twist the narrative to make it look like you're the problem. Jackson's heart pounded. He'd fought too hard to let them tear him down again. Let them try. I'm not backing off. You need to be smart about this, Keller cautioned. They have the upper hand right now, and if you go charging in, you'll give them exactly what they want. We need more time. We need more evidence. That officer I mentioned, he could be the key to all of this. I'm working on tracking him down, but we have to be careful. Jackson knew Keller was right. Charging ahead blindly would only play into the Hawthorns' hands, but waiting felt like poison in his veins. He'd spent too long in silence. Still, patience was necessary. He had to bide his time until they had the evidence to blow the case wide open. The next few days passed in a blur. Jackson kept a low profile, avoiding the places where he might run into members of the Hawthorne family or their circle of influence. Every time he walked down the street, he felt eyes on him, as if the whole town was waiting for him to fail. The weight of those stares fueled his determination. He would not let them win. At night, he'd retreat to the house, studying old case files and legal precedents, looking for any crack in the Hawthorns' carefully constructed wall of lies. He was a businessman now, someone used to negotiating contracts and deals, but this was a different kind of fight. It was personal, and the stakes were far higher. Then, one evening, Keller called again. This time, the tension in his voice was different. There was a glimmer of hope. I found him, Keller said without preamble. The officer? Jackson asked, his heart skipping a beat. Yeah, his name's Mike Harrigan. He's been off the grid for a while, living out in a cabin on the outskirts of town. Left the force quietly, no official explanation. But the word is, He had some sort of falling out with the Hawthorns, and it wasn't pretty. Jackson felt the adrenaline surge through him. "Can we talk to him?" Keller paused. "That's the tricky part. Harrigan's been keeping to himself for years. He doesn't trust anyone, especially not anyone from town. But if we can convince him to talk, he might have the missing piece we need." Jackson knew this was it. They had to approach Harrigan carefully, gain his trust, and convince him to testify. It wouldn't be easy. People like Harrigan didn't just come forward after being silenced for so long, but if anyone could do it, it was Keller. "I'll go with you," Jackson said firmly. "This is my fight, and if he's the key to it, I need to be there." Keller hesitated but then agreed. "All right, tomorrow morning. I'll pick you up at 9. The next morning, Jackson stood outside his house, waiting as Keller's car pulled up to the curb. The air was thick with tension as they drove in silence toward Harrigan's cabin. The town slowly faded behind them, replaced by dense trees and winding roads. Jackson's mind raced with the possibilities. What would Harrigan say? Would he confirm their suspicions about the Hawthorns, or would he remain silent, too afraid to speak out? As they approached the cabin, Jackson could feel his pulse quicken. The place looked weathered and isolated, the kind of place someone went to disappear. Keller parked the car, and they stepped out, making their way up the dirt path toward the front door. Jackson knocked, the sound echoing through the quiet woods. For a long moment, there was no answer, and Jackson wondered if Harrigan had changed his mind about meeting them. But then, the door creaked open, revealing a man who looked much older than Jackson had expected. Mike Harrigan stood in the doorway, his face lined with years of stress and regret. His eyes, however, were sharp and cautious. "You're the ones looking for trouble," Harrigan said, his voice rough from disuse. Jackson met his gaze. "We're looking for the truth." Harrigan studied them for a moment before stepping aside, letting them in. The cabin's interior was sparse, a reflection of the man who lived there. Jackson could sense that this wasn't going to be an easy conversation, but they had come too far to turn back now. Once inside, Harrigan sat down in a worn-out chair, motioning for them to sit as well. "I left that town for a reason," he began, his tone guarded. "You want to dig up the past, but trust me when I say, some things are better left buried." Jackson leaned forward, his voice steady. "They framed me, and you know it. The Hawthorns had something to do with it, didn't they?" Harrigan's eyes flickered with something. Regret, maybe fear, but he didn't deny it. "There are things about that family you don't understand," Harrigan said quietly. "They've got their hands in everything. People disappear, evidence goes missing, and no one ever questions it because they know what happens when you do." "But you're still here," Keller said, breaking the silence. "You left the force, but you didn't leave because you wanted to. You left because you couldn't keep being part of their game anymore, didn't you?" Harrigan's jaw clenched, and for a long moment he didn't speak. Then, finally, he nodded. "I didn't sign up to be their puppet," he admitted. "But I wasn't strong enough to fight them either." Jackson's heart raced. "Then help us. Tell us what you know. We can take them down together." Harrigan hesitated, his eyes dark with the weight of years spent in silence. Then, with a slow nod, he said, "I'll tell you everything, but you better be ready for what comes next." As Harrigan began to speak, Jackson knew they had just crossed a line. There would be no going back now. What Jackson uncovered changed his life forever and exposed the truth to the entire town. But this is just the beginning of his journey to justice. Want to find out how the story ends? Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us create more stories like this. See you in the next episode.